In the small, isolated town of Hollow Creek, Friday the 13th was not just another date on the calendar. It was an event, a shadow looming over the lives of its residents. For generations, the townspeople adhered to a peculiar ritual, a lottery held in the old church at the town's center. Nobody spoke openly about its purpose, but the whispers that flitted through the narrow streets hinted at something far darker than mere tradition. Evan, a quiet young man who had lived in Hollow Creek all his life, felt the weight of the day as soon as he woke up. The town seemed quieter than usual, the streets deserted, the air heavier. He had always found the lottery unsettling, though he had never been chosen. Like everyone else, he went through the motions, placing his name in the urn without question. To do otherwise was unthinkable. That morning, the townspeople gathered in somber silence inside the church. The atmosphere was suffocating, the walls seeming to press inward with the weight of countless past lotteries. The mayor, an older man with sharp, calculating eyes, stood at the pulpit, his voice steady as he recited the same words spoken every year. "This tradition binds us together," he proclaimed. "Through it, we honor our past and ensure our future." The drawing began. One by one, names were called out, only to be met with sighs of relief as the chosen were dismissed. Then, Evan's name rang through the cold air. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt. Faces turned toward him, their expressions a mix of pity and resignation. Evan's heart pounded as the reality of the moment sank in. The mayor gave him a small, solemn nod, motioning for him to come forward. The crowd parted like a living tide, and Evan walked to the front, every step echoing like a hammer driving nails into a coffin. The lottery was over. Evan had won. Evan sat in the dim light of the mayor's office, the room heavy with the smell of old wood and dust. The drawn curtains added a suffocating stillness to the space, as if the outside world had ceased to exist. The mayor sat across from him, a heavy ledger open on the desk between them. No words were spoken at first. Only the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock filled the silence, a sound that seemed to stretch time unbearably. Finally, the mayor cleared his throat. "You'll need to prepare," he said, his tone even but devoid of emotion. "Tonight, at sundown, the ritual will take place." Evan's mind reeled. The word ritual hung in the air like a threat. He managed to nod, his throat too tight to speak. The mayor leaned back in his chair, his gaze unreadable, and began recounting the town's grim legacy. Hollow Creek had not always been prosperous, he explained. Decades ago, it had been on the brink of ruin, failing crops, devastating storms, and illness had nearly wiped it out. In desperation, the townsfolk had turned to an ancient legend whispered in the surrounding hills, a tale of a pact made with a being that could grant prosperity in exchange for a blood offering. And so, the mayor continued, the lottery began. One name, one sacrifice, every 13 years. The chosen individual ensures the safety and prosperity of everyone else. His voice betrayed no remorse, only a cold acceptance of necessity. Evan felt a chill run through him as he realized the weight of what had been thrust upon him. This was no symbolic gesture. He wasn't merely a participant in a quaint tradition. He was the offering. The mayor's expression softened slightly as he gestured to a book on the desk, its leather cover cracked with age. "You are not the first, and you will not be the last. Remember, your sacrifice will save this town." Evan's stomach churned at the thought. He nodded mechanically, rising to leave. As he stepped out of the office, the late afternoon sun felt cruelly indifferent. The town's secret had been revealed, and Evan now bore its full weight. Evan wandered aimlessly through the narrow streets of Hollow Creek as the afternoon wore on. Every corner of the town now seemed sinister, each building a silent witness to the ritual he had unwillingly become a part of. Faces peered at him from behind curtains and half-closed doors. Nobody spoke to him, but their stares weighed heavy, a mixture of pity and relief that it wasn't them this time. Panic bubbled beneath the surface of his thoughts. He had to leave. Staying meant certain death, and while the townspeople might accept their fate, Evan wasn't ready to resign himself to it. He tried to recall the stories of those who had supposedly tried to escape in the past. Their fates had always been left vague, shrouded in warnings whispered behind closed doors. Evan returned home, moving quickly and with purpose. He grabbed a backpack, stuffing it with essentials, a flashlight, water, and what little cash he had. His plan was simple: slip away under the cover of darkness and follow the old road out of town. As dusk settled, Evan slipped out through the back door, the cold evening air biting at his skin. He avoided the main streets, sticking to side paths and overgrown trails. His every step felt like a gamble, each rustling leaf or snapping twig a potential giveaway. When he reached the edge of town, the road stretched before him, its cracked asphalt barely visible under the faint glow of the moon. He took a deep breath and started walking, his heart pounding with each step. The forest on either side seemed alive, the trees swaying as if murmuring among themselves. Suddenly, the air grew heavy, the stillness unnerving. Evan felt a prickling at the back of his neck and turned, expecting to see someone following him. The road was empty, but something about the silence felt oppressive, unnatural. He quickened his pace, but with every step, the feeling of being watched intensified. Then, the sound of voices broke through the quiet. They came from behind him, low and guttural, like murmurs carried on the wind. Evan froze, his pulse racing. He glanced back, and in the distance, faint lights flickered through the trees. Torches. Realization struck him like a blow. The townspeople were coming for him. Evan's feet pounded against the cracked asphalt as he ran, the torchlight growing brighter behind him. The voices grew louder, their tone urgent and unified, as if chanting in a language he couldn't understand. Panic clawed at his chest, urging him forward into the dense woods that lined the road. The trees closed in around him as he stumbled through the undergrowth, branches clawing at his clothes and face. The forest was darker here, the moonlight barely penetrating the thick canopy above. Every step was treacherous, the uneven ground threatening to trip him at every turn. Yet, the voices never faded. They were closer now, accompanied by the faint sound of footsteps. His lungs burned as he pushed onward, but the forest seemed endless, a labyrinth that twisted and turned back on itself. Just as despair began to take hold, he broke into a clearing. In its center stood an ancient stone altar, weathered by time and covered in moss. Around it, symbols carved into the ground glowed faintly, pulsing with a sickly, otherworldly light. Evan's breath hitched as he realized where he was. This was the place. He had heard whispers of it as a child, a site older than the town itself, a place where the pact had first been made. Before he could turn and flee, the townspeople emerged from the shadows, encircling him. Their faces were eerily calm, their movements precise and deliberate. The mayor stepped forward, his expression one of grim resolve. "You cannot outrun this," the mayor said, his voice firm but not unkind. "The pact binds us all. It will not let you leave." Evan looked around, searching for a gap in the circle, but the group was impenetrable. He was forced toward the altar, the glowing symbols casting an eerie light on their faces. As he was pressed closer, a new presence filled the air. The oppressive silence of the woods was replaced by a low hum, vibrating deep in his chest. The very air seemed to ripple, and shadows around the altar twisted unnaturally. Something ancient was awakening. Evan's mind screamed for him to fight, to run, but his body refused to move. The symbols glowed brighter, the hum rising to a deafening crescendo. The ground beneath him seemed to pulse like a heartbeat, and then a voice, deep, guttural, and inhuman, spoke from nowhere and everywhere at once. It demanded the offering. The voice reverberated through Evan's body, shaking him to his core. It wasn't just a sound, it was a presence, something vast and incomprehensible, pressing down on him from every direction. The townspeople stood motionless, their eyes lowered, as if in reverence or fear. Evan's knees buckled, but he forced himself upright. His mind raced, clawing for a way out. The glowing symbols on the ground pulsed faster now, their light casting grotesque, shifting shadows across the clearing. Whatever entity the townspeople had bargained with was here, its attention fixed on him. He took a step back, but the circle of townspeople closed in, their faces blank, their movements mechanical. There was no escape. The mayor stepped forward again, his voice calm but urgent. "Evan, your sacrifice is necessary. Without it, the pact will break, and the town will fall into ruin. This is the way it has always been." The words felt rehearsed, hollow, as if the mayor himself didn't entirely believe them anymore. Evan's gaze darted to the altar, the symbols, the shadows writhing just beyond the edges of the clearing. He couldn't accept this, not for himself, not for anyone. Then, he noticed something, a break in the pattern of symbols on the ground, a faint crack in their otherwise seamless glow. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it gave him an idea. If the symbols were what bound this ritual together, perhaps disrupting them could weaken the entity's hold. Summoning every ounce of courage, Evan lunged toward the crack. The townspeople moved to stop him, but they were too slow. His foot came down hard, scraping across the fragile line of glowing carvings. The effect was immediate. The pulsing light faltered, and the hum turned into a piercing wail. The ground shook violently, sending several townspeople sprawling. The oppressive force that had held him in place lifted, replaced by a chaotic energy that made the very air vibrate. The voice boomed again, no longer commanding but enraged. The shadows around the altar surged, twisting and expanding, as if the entity were trying to maintain its grip on the world. Evan stumbled back, his body trembling, but the symbols were fading now, their light dimming to nothing. The clearing erupted into chaos. The townspeople screamed, some running blindly into the woods, others collapsing where they stood. The altar cracked down the middle, sending chunks of stone tumbling to the ground. The shadows writhed one last time before imploding into the void, leaving nothing but silence. Evan fell to his knees, gasping for air. The clearing was eerily still now, the glowing symbols gone, the altar reduced to rubble. The townspeople, those who remained, stared at him in disbelief. He had broken the cycle. The silence was almost as deafening as the entity's roar had been. Evan remained on his knees, the cold earth beneath him grounding him to the moment. The air felt different now, lighter, as if the suffocating presence that had loomed over Hollow Creek for generations was finally gone. Slowly, the townspeople began to gather themselves. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide with fear and confusion. For a moment, no one spoke. They looked at the shattered altar, at the extinguished symbols, and finally at Evan, who was still catching his breath. The mayor approached him cautiously, his usually stoic expression replaced with something resembling vulnerability. "What have you done?" he whispered, though the words carried no malice, only uncertainty. Evan looked up at him, his voice raw and unsteady. "I ended it. The pact, it's over." The weight of his statement hung in the air, heavy with implications. Without the pact, the town's prosperity was no longer assured. The crops might fail, the storms might return, and the fragile balance they had clung to for so long could crumble. But for the first time in decades, they were free from the entity's grip. As dawn broke over the horizon, the residents of Hollow Creek began to disperse, their movements slow and aimless. Some left without a word, retreating to their homes to process what had happened. Others lingered near the ruins of the altar, their expressions a mix of relief and apprehension. Evan walked back toward the town, the weight of exhaustion settling over him. He felt no triumph, only the numb realization that life would never be the same, for him or for anyone else. In the following days, the town was consumed by uncertainty. Rumors spread like wildfire about what Evan had done, some calling him a savior, others blaming him for dooming them all. The mayor avoided him, his once commanding presence now diminished. Evan, however, felt no regret. As he stood at the edge of town one evening, staring at the dense forest that had been the site of his near demise, he knew he had made the only choice he could live with. For the first time, the woods seemed quiet, truly quiet. He turned and walked away, leaving Hollow Creek behind. Whatever the future held for the town, it was no longer his burden to bear. And as the shadows lengthened across the fields, the broken altar lay silent, its glow extinguished forever.